If you saw any of this testimony, you could tell he had zero interest in being on that stand and testifying. We were then revealed the contents of this discussion, right? In the back and forth between Mr. Spill and Judge Glanville, it wasn't really revealed exactly the substance of what they were talking about, but we then learned by way of court filings and Kayla Bumpass that it turns out that Judge Glanville had apparently asked Mr. Copeland, so Lil Woody, he asked, if he's prepared to testify. And Copeland said, hey, I'm going to plead the fifth, right? So he, and if, if you saw any of this testimony, you could tell he had zero interest in being on that stand and testifying. At some point, she asks him, how old are you? He's like, grown. She then says, what is your age in numbers? And he says, I plead the fifth. And it's kind of crazy because, when it comes to pleading the fifth, I mean, you really can only plead the fifth with respect to questions that could cause you to incriminate yourself. And so there's not really anything incriminating about your age, right? But in this situation, I think just in general, he wanted to just as a blanket matter plead the fifth. The interesting thing is the DA was already giving him immunity, right? And so they were having this discussion about his understanding of immunity, right? Because, and it's very easy. Like we as lawyers, we get in the room, we're talking about all these legal matters that we're used to dealing with every single day. And it's easy to forget that there are lay people in the room who these matters affect their lives and they may not understand. So they started to explain apparently immunity and engaging his understanding of immunity. And so he ends up being told that, hey, listen, if you don't testify, right? Because he had already expressed, I don't want to testify. And they're like, if you don't testify, I can hold you indefinitely, right? So I can hold you in custody indefinitely if you refuse to testify. And he apparently had been under this understanding that it would be like a limited amount of time that he could be held in contempt and held in jail for refusing to testify. But it turns out that it was indefinitely. And indefinitely means with no end in sight. So you could see how, from a defense standpoint, if we have this witness who's supposed to be the star witness for the prosecution, and they're having this conversation, which could be perceived as a threat, saying, hey, if you don't take the stand, and the next step would be basically saying, like, if you don't take the stand and say what we want you to say, we can hold you in contempt and keep you in custody indefinitely, then anybody is gonna say, okay, well, I'm gonna testify, right? Because who wants to just go to jail indefinitely? Just naturally, he's like, I'm gonna testify. I don't want to be locked up with no, end date in sight. But the interesting thing that he followed up with is that he said, I'm gonna testify, but everything I'm going to say is going to be a lie. The meeting ended and the parties end up going into the courtroom. So this conversation happened in the judge's chambers. It should have been taken down on the record that everything he was going to say is a lie. The defense team is going to be able to use that, right? Because, you told prosecutors that everything that you were going to say is a lie.